You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the solved case of the Beauty Queen Killer, and this is the first episode in Wicked Winter. Now, this was a killer that was identified from the very first victim, and yet no one could catch him. It was a 6-week span of horrific crimes, but nobody knew where to find him or how to make him stop. His criminal record started long before this, and yet he just always happened to get away with it. But he wouldn't this time. By the way, I am posting so much this month for Wicked Winter. I did this series last December and you guys really loved it. I will leave a playlist of all those videos down below, but I'm doing it again this year and I hope you were just as excited to hear these cases because they are going to be anywhere from just completely wicked to Christmas themed and anything in between. So yeah. If that's something you're interested in, please subscribe. I would absolutely love if you did. And if you wanted to thumbs up this video and leave a nice comment down below, I always love replying to those. But now let's get back to the story. So it was 1984 in Florida, and Rosario Gonzalez was a 20-year-old model who was living in Miami and working there as well at the Miami Grand Prix for race car drivers. And she was a spokesmodel. She handed out aspirin to the race car drivers, and she was very well known by all of them. She was described as sweet and innocent. She had just recently gotten engaged, and she was described as the type of girl that you would marry. But on February 26th, she would be working and she would just disappear. And the last time anyone ever saw her was walking alongside a race car driver. A week later, another woman would go missing in the Miami area, and this was on March 5th when 23-year-old Elizabeth Kenyon went missing as well, and she actually went by Beth. She was a teacher at a local high school, and she would often teach the special needs children and really help them out in the areas that they struggled with. She was also a cheerleading coach, but she really cared about the children and their well-being and especially their mental health, and she even talked down a student from their suicidal thoughts at one point. And she was just such a wonderful soul, and her heart was so pure, and she always kept in contact with her family. And that is why immediately Beth was reported missing, because they knew that she would not do this to make them anxious for her at all. She always kept in contact with them. However, investigators just brushed this off as a runaway and didn't want to do anything with this case, but her parents were fighters and they were not going to let this be the end of it. They went and hired private investigators to do their own research into where Beth had gone. They went to Beth's apartment. They found kind of a whole photo album of pictures she had, and they took that out and they started going to all the areas that were around this high school she worked at to see if anyone had seen her the day she disappeared. And that is when they would go to a local gas station, and the gas station attendant would know quite a few things. Now, while flipping through this photo album, the gas station attendant recognized Beth and said that that very day she was there getting gas, and then he saw a picture of a man, and he said, but this man was there too. He said when Beth was getting gas, this man pulled up and offered to pay for it for her, and then Beth had told him that they were going to go out and do a photo shoot together, and she was going to be the model. Upon hearing this tip, private investigators went to Beth's parents and said, can you identify this man for me, because he was said to be with your daughter the day she disappeared? And immediately her parents said, oh yeah, that's Chris Wilder. That's Beth's ex that she dated for a while, but when he asked her to marry him, she said no. And Beth's mom also said that she had come up to her and said, Mom, I've never even kissed the guy, and he asked me to marry him. Apparently they had just gone on a few dates. It wasn't like they were really deep into a relationship when he asked her to marry him. It was just a few dates in, and he had already done so of course she said no. But her mother also said that Chris was the perfect gentleman. So when the investigators began to search for Christopher Bernard Wilder, they went to his home and they started to talk to him. However, it would be what they would find in his trash that would really make a difference, because they began to piece together the previous missing persons case that we were talking about before Beth, of Rosario. You see, they found a photograph of Christopher in the trash with his race car at the very race car track that Rosario had gone missing from. He raced his Porsche 911 there quite often and actually knew Rosario and would photograph her often. And they had known each other pretty well, and multiple witnesses had seen a guy matching his description with her that day. And Rosario and Beth looked incredibly alike, and investigators began to believe this wasn't a coincidence. Now, they actually talked to Christopher at his home. However, he said he didn't know what happened to Beth, that he actually hadn't spoken to her in a month because they weren't dating. She had said no to his marriage proposal and they were still friends, but they hadn't hung out all the time. And after the police left from the questioning, Beth's parents actually contacted the FBI for help because after this, Christopher disappeared and they could no longer find him at his house, and they believed there was a possible abductor on the loose. 13 days later, on March 18th, another woman would go missing, this time from Merritt Island, which was still in Florida, but it was 3 hours from Miami, and this was a 21-year-old Teresa Waite Ferguson, who would last be seen with a man matching Christopher's description at the Merritt Island Mall. 2 days later, 19-year-old Linda Grover would go missing as well, this time 4 hours from Merritt Island in Tallahassee. She had been a student at Florida State University, and she had gone missing from the Governor's Square Mall. But thankfully, she would be found alive. Police found Linda in a hotel in Bainbridge, Georgia, and she was banging on the walls, screaming at the top of her lungs, and she had locked herself in this bathroom. They rescued her, they took her to the hospital, and when they let her get some rest, they began to question her on what had happened and why she had locked herself in, why the police needed to be called. She had said that she had been at the Governor's Square Mall that day when she had been approached by a man who had said that he was a photographer and that he would really like to shoot her as his model, and he believed she was perfect for the shoot. He said his portfolio was in his car, so if she'd come out there, he would show it to her, and she thought because it was daylight out that she wouldn't really need to worry about it too much, so she did follow him. However, he would then shove her into his car after beating her unconscious, and finally on the ride there she would wake up and he would notice that she was waking up, and he would proceed to tie her up, put her in a sleeping bag, and put her in his trunk before driving to the Glen Oaks motel. Once there, he began to torture Linda and sexually assault her, and even put copper wires on her feet, where he proceeded to electrocute her. And she was also blinded by super glue, and this torture went on for hours before she finally, in some sort of miracle, got away from him and ran to the bathroom, where she locked herself in and began to scream bloody murder. And because of her screams, he was thought to have been worried that someone would catch him, and so he fled with all of his belongings. Now, Linda would be given a photographic lineup where multiple different men would be posted, and she would pick out if her abductor was in one of those photos, and she immediately picked Christopher Wilder. Now, 2 days later, he would find his next victim. He had traveled from Georgia to Beaumont, Texas, and this had been almost 9 hours away. He completely fled, and he would also have taken out $19,000 from his bank account. It was caught on the cameras at the bank, so this would mean he would be able to pay cash everywhere, so he couldn't be traced, and this would just make it even harder for investigators. However, he would not be abducting a woman the next day, because he had approached a woman named Terry and asked about this photo shoot, and she had actually denied him. But then the next day was March 23rd, and 23-year-old Terry Walden would disappear from the local mall, and witnesses would say she had been with a man matching Christopher's description that day before she disappeared, that a man like that had approached her. She wasn't necessarily with him. However, 2 days prior, witnesses said that she had actually been seen with him at her school, Lamar University, and had then allegedly told him that she didn't want what he was trying to give her, which was thought to be the photo shoot. Terry was not only a nursing student, but a wife and a mother. She also had a rust-colored 1981 Mercury Cougar that was now missing from the parking lot as well. Investigators began to think that this was Christopher's new ride, that when he took Terry, he also took her car. The same day Terry was abducted, Teresa Ferguson, who had gone missing from Marriott Island previously, was officially found. She was in Canaveral Groves and had been beaten by a tire iron and strangled, and investigators and FBI alike knew that they now had a serial killer on their hands, and yet the only things that had been talked about in the media about Christopher was after the first two ladies had gone missing, when he was being looked into as a suspect. However, it didn't ever say his name or his picture. It just said that he was a race car driver and that he was Australian, which Christopher was, but nobody actually said his name. 2 days later, on March 25th, 21-year-old Suzanne Logan would go missing from Penn Square Mall in Oklahoma. This was at such an incredible rate that these women were going missing, and it was absolutely terrifying. The next day, Terry Walden would be found nearby where she had gone missing. She was found in a canal, and she had been stabbed to death in the breast 43 times. Now, where it was said that Christopher had taken Terry's car, he had left his own car there. And so, of course, the police took his car in to search it for evidence, and they actually found DNA of Teresa Ferguson inside, matching Christopher to her disappearance as well. They were certain now that it was Christopher Wilder who was committing all of these murders, except they still couldn't find him, and they even had an APB out on the Mercury Cougar that he was said to be driving. The day after that, it was March 27th, when Suzanne Logan's body would be found by a fisherman in Junction City, Kansas. Now, it was found that a man matching Christopher's descriptions had checked in to an I-35 inn, and this was the night prior to finding Suzanne's body, and then he would drive to Junction City, where he would stab her to death in the woods. She had been bitten in the breast and had her hair all over her body shaved off. Then on March 28th, they would finally get a tip on Christopher's location. This was the first time they had ever been able to track him down and know where he was at a specific time, and not after he already fled. And this was in Rifle, Colorado, where a hotel had got a hit on using a Visa card that the police knew Christopher had stolen. It was from someone he knew and was not his, but he had been said to steal it and use it, and they got a hit on this card. And so they rushed there, and they got there the next morning, and he had already fled. He was headed to Grand Junction, Colorado, where he would find his next victim at the Macy's shopping mall. This time it was a 19-year-old named Cheryl Bonaventure, and they would be seen together in a diner in Silverton, and they were telling the employees that they were headed to Las Vegas, that they were going to stop in Durango, and that they were also a married couple. The next day, the two were seen and checking into a hotel in Page Boy Motel in Page, Arizona, and they were still saying that they were a married couple. However, after this, she vanished. Cheryl was no longer seen with him or seen at all. The next day, it was April 1st, and the Meadows Mall had obviously not heard about this possible serial killer on the loose, because they were not only a mall, which was what was Christopher's perfect place to go find his victims, but they were also going to be hosting a 17 magazine photo shoot competition, meaning that there would be many models in this mall, which is exactly what Christopher liked. it. It would be no surprise to police when they found out that this was happening and that also a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Korfman had gone missing. Now, this was the first time Michelle even tried to go out and do any sort of modeling, so of course if someone approached her and said, "Hey, I would love to give you a job," she would have taken it. She was also only 17, probably very naive. Upon hearing that this happened, the police immediately demanded all of the photographs that had been taken that day to be sent to them so they could comb through them and see if they could see Christopher at all or find anything strange. And they would. They would find the perfect picture of Christopher Wilder staring up at the 17-year-old girl who would go missing. It was completely eerie knowing who he was and what he did. April 4th, he would abduct a 16-year-old girl named Tina Marie Rizzico from Torrance, California, in a local mall where she was just going around looking for a job when he approached her saying that he had a job for her, that she would be the perfect model, and once again, he lured her in. From there, she would vanish. However, 6 days later, she would be seen in another mall helping in the abduction of Dawnette Wilt. This was in Indiana. However, April 12th, Dawnette would be seen again. She had crawled out of the woods and was on the side of the road when she was thankfully rescued in New York. She had been stabbed multiple times by Christopher Wilder. She had survived and could identify him as being her abductor and her attacker, and she could have died that day, but she didn't. Then also in New York, 33-year-old Beth Dodge would go missing, as well as her Pontiac Firebird, and this was at the Eastview Mall, and Tina would be driving the Mercury Cougar behind them. Strangely enough, Tina would then be dropped off at the Logan Airport, given money to buy an airplane ticket, and she went home back to Los Angeles completely safe. But she had plenty to tell investigators. Tina said the day she went with Christopher when he lured her in, saying that she was going to be doing a photo shoot. He really did take her to a local park to do a photo shoot. They were taking pictures, and then all of a sudden he pointed a gun at her head, told her to get in the car, and so she did, and he took her to a local hotel where he began to sexually assault her and electrocute her. This was continuing for so long, except for when he heard something on the TV and immediately stopped. You see, this would be when Christopher would see himself on the TV, because he was being placed on the 10 most wanted list. It was publicized everywhere, and anybody watching TV would know his face and know to look out for him, and immediately he wanted to run, and he told Tina that he would let her go if she would help him abduct another victim. And so she did so. She helped abduct Dawnette Wilt, who Christopher took to a hotel room, sexually assaulted, then took her to the woods and tried to kill her. However, she survived, and Christopher had a feeling that he hadn't killed her, went back, but Dawnette had already escaped. That's when Christopher decided they needed a new car, and that is why Beth Dodge was abducted, mainly for her car, and Tina followed him like he had told her. And then Tina said that Christopher took Beth out to the woods, shot her twice, and then took Tina to the airport and dropped her off and let her go. And Tina said she didn't know why he did that, and she also didn't know why she didn't run the multiple times she could have. But for those of you who don't know, situations like these can bring out many different responses in different people, because not only is there fight or flight, there is also freeze and fawn. And this is something that I want to tell you guys a little bit about, because I think in all of these cases it can truly give you a different perspective on what these people are going through at the time. Now, of course, we all know what a fight response is: to confront the threat until it's no longer endangers your safety, and it's for individuals who will fight tooth and nail to survive, to get out of that situation. And In this case, that is like Donnette, who did not just sit there and die. She crawled to the road to get picked up so she could survive. She did not just let herself succumb to what she could have just let happen to her. There's also flight, which means you run from the threat at all costs. You don't care what will happen if you do. You don't think of the repercussions. You'd rather be in danger running than if you just stayed still, because that's just your response. You just want to get out of there no matter if it's worse in the situation or not. That doesn't even occur in the brain. It's just your natural response to flee. And then we have freeze, which occurs when individuals just shut down and are unable to process the situation in front of them. They are often not able to fight in the moment. They have fear enveloping them. They don't even think that fighting is an option because their whole system has shut down. Now, I'm not sure that anyone in this case necessarily fits the freeze response, but I do think that flight would be Linda Grover, who immediately upon finding a moment that she could get up and leave, did so and ran into the bathroom to get away. Now, the one that I have been diving into learning more about recently is one that not a lot of people know about, and that is the fawn response. Now, this is individuals that I would say have the ultimate survival instinct. They are chameleons in the face of predators. They do what it takes to lessen the threat against them, meaning if they have to become friends with the threat, they will. And if that stops them from being prey, they will do whatever it takes. They learn exactly what the predator wants to maximize their chance of survival. Now, I do see fawn response in a lot of child/teen abductions, and I do wonder if this is because it would be easier to, let yourself succumb to doing whatever the abductor wants when you are a child or a younger victim, and you do kind of still see an adult as more superior, whereas an adult in this situation would be a little bit harder to do whatever this abductor or predator says. And I do wonder if there's a correlation there. However, this can happen with anyone at any age, but it's just something that I have seen in many different cases. And of course, the victims here that were older didn't necessarily show any signs of having the fawn response. However, Tina really did, and she was the 16-year-old, so this would make sense. I think Tina was doing this without even knowing what she was doing, and because of this, Christopher trusted her enough to let her help and then let her go. Now, what I've researched from Stockholm Syndrome is a bit different than the fawn response. They do seem as though they could go hand in hand. However, there is a little bit of a difference. You see, Stockholm Syndrome is the psychological alliance of a victim to their captor due to a relief feeling as they're being chosen to survive in the moment. Say there are multiple different victims and they are the ones that are chosen to survive in that moment. They get a sense of relief, a rush, you can say, that's just overwhelming joy that they are still alive. And this causes them to have some sort of bond with their captor. It's a strong sense of gratitude that triumphs all hate because they get to survive at least for that moment. And I can see when your brain is in such a stressful situation how you could go into that mode, because your brain can only handle so much torture and stress and just complete terror. And so if that can grant you a little bit of peace in the moment, I could see how some of our brains do go to that. However, just like fawn, Stockholm Syndrome has the main symptom of being very hypervigilant of what the predator wants in order to survive, and the emotions of them in order to stay safe, and just knowing, kind of trying to predict their next move so you can be on top of it too. And of course, minds are very complex, and there can be different responses for different people at different times, and you can have, two different responses at the same time, and you can never really fully, I don't think, say what somebody is going to do based on what they've done before or just based on research. I mean, I think so much more goes into it, and the way our brains work in stressful, traumatic situations is so intriguing to me, and I really hope that this kind of taught you a little bit that you didn't know before. But please do remember, I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist, and this is just stuff that I have researched on my own and also put with some experiences that I have as well. So I hope that I gave you that information in the best way possible. And of course, I always urge you to do more research on stuff like that. But yes, I thought that that was very intriguing and could definitely tell you a little more as to why Tina continued to follow him around and then why Christopher let her go, because I don't think it's as simple as he liked her, because in the mind of a serial killer, that's not necessarily enough. But it was now April 13th, and Christopher Wilder was on the move again, this time in Colebrook, New Hampshire. And he was at Vic's Gary Station, which was a gas station in this area that was kind of close by the Canadian border. And he had stopped to ask a gas station attendant what all he would need to go through this border. He was planning to flee the country. However, a miracle would happen instead, because two state troopers would pull up to this gas station just by chance. Their names were Leo Jellison and Wayne Fortier, and they would pull up and immediately recognize Christopher, but also his car, which was the Pontiac Firebird that belonged to Beth Dodge. The officers jumped out and began to ask Christopher if they could ask him some questions. However, Christopher ran back to his car to grab his gun. Now at this point, Jellison would run up behind him and try to grab the gun as he was kind of holding him from behind, and that's when two shots would ring out. Jellison had been shot in the chest, but Christopher had been in front of him, meaning that the gun had gone through him too. Christopher instantly died at the age of 39 at 2 p.m. that day, and Jellison actually survived this incident, and a killer had been caught. But this had been far too easy on him. In the eyes of some, they believed that he didn't ever have to be punished for what he did, and they were very angered by this. Now, the FBI said it brought a feeling of relief that he is no longer a fugitive, that there will be no new victims, but there are so many questions to ask him. The one person who could answer all of them is dead. A month later, on May 3rd, the body of Cheryl Bonaventura would be found in Utah. She had been shot to death after going on the road trip with Christopher, where she was telling everyone that she was married to him. Now, on May 11th, the body of the 17-year-old Michelle Korfman from the 17 magazine photo shoot would also be found in California and identified in June, meaning that out of 9 of Christopher's victims, 7 had been found and 2 had not. That had been Rosario Gonzalez and Elizabeth Kenyon, who had been his first 2 victims, or what are thought to be his first 2 victims. 3 of those 9 victims had actually survived. But as amazing as that is, they still had to endure that torture and live with it and heal from that. And that is probably one of the hardest things you could ever have to do. Linda Grover, after screaming in the hotel room, Donette Willett, after crawling to safety, and Tina Marie Rizzico, who was let go after being put through a tremendous amount of psychological torture as well as physical. Many believed there were many more victims connected to the beauty queen killer, as everyone was calling Christopher Wilder, but nobody could properly say if there was. But before we get into the possible cases that could be connected to Christopher Wilder, let's look into his past, because of course we all want to know what made him this way. Why did he do this? Well, he was born on March 13th, 1945 in Sydney, Australia, to an American father and an Australian mother. He had actually almost died at childbirth, and then again at 2 because he almost drowned. At this point, he would also start to have convulsions and had to be resuscitated. However, except for his health problems, he had a pretty normal, happy childhood. He was a peeping Tom from a young age, but nothing really too terribly awful would occur to him or because of him until he was 17 years old, when he sexually assaulted a 13-year-old girl with 2 other boys, and he denied this but was sentenced to probation for a year and sentenced to electroshock therapy, which was supposed to kind of cure him of these thoughts and these actions. However, it was said to have just made it worse. At that point, he wanted to shock women, and as we know now, that is what he eventually would do. Now, this is what we had talked about in the David Michael Kruger case about some of these forms of therapy that these institutes were doing to try to get them to stop being this way, only really made them 10 times worse. Now, can we blame that on what he would eventually do? I'm not sure, because he was already showing those malicious, monstrous behaviors before then. I'm just not sure that it helps in any way. 5 years later, Christopher was 22, and he would get married for a week before getting divorced. And then the year after that was 1969, when he would move from Australia to the United States. And this was said to be because he had been blackmailing a young high school girl for nude photos, and he was being caught for that, so he fled. This is where he started a construction company. It was said to make really good money. He didn't stop assaulting young girls, though. He, in fact, just had his wealth help him in that way. He loved to do photography on the side, so that became part of his MO. And he, because he had money, could get these girls to really believe he could do something to help their modeling careers. 8 years later, in 1977, Christopher would be arrested for forcing a high school girl to perform sexual acts on him, or she would be beaten by him. Now, allegedly, at the trial, the judge asked if he was sane enough to stand trial, and he just flat out said that he had been pleasuring himself at the thought of assaulting young girls twice a week. And he actually said that in a much more horrific manner than I'm willing to say on this channel. 3 years later, his first abduction was thought to occur on April 13th, 1980, of Carla Hendry, who was in Massachusetts when he attempted to kidnap her. Thankfully, she did escape, though. 2 years after this, Christopher would succeed in an abduction, and this was of 2 15-year-old girls who he forced to pose nude. He was back in Australia visiting his parents, so this is where he abducted the girls, and his license plate was seen from the abduction, and it was traced back to him. He was caught, he was arrested. However, his parents posted a $350,000 bail, and he was allowed to go back to the United States, where he went to Florida. And they were still awaiting the whole process of getting his trial to go through 2 years later, which is why in 1984 he was still in Florida and this spree of killing began. Now, we know about 9 victims, however, there are thought to have been possibly so many more. Now, a case that is really theorized to be Christopher Wilder's doing is that of the Wanda Beach murders of Mariana Smith and Christine Sharrock near Sydney, Australia on January 11th of 1965. Christopher lived in Australia at this time until 1969, so he would have been in the area. He was thought to be the #1 suspect in this case. However, it was long before his murders were thought to begin. He was just abducting at this point and assaulting, so it can't truly be said, and there's no way to link him to it. A bit later, there was a 17-year-old named Mary Opez, who was from Fort Myers, Florida, who would go missing on January 16th, 1981, and then another girl named Mary Hare would disappear a month later from the same location, and Christopher was thought to be the abductor. Mary Hare was actually found a month later, stabbed to death. The next year, in 1982, 2 women's bodies were found near a property that Christopher owned. Once again, couldn't be linked. Then in 1983, a year before this 6-week murder spree had occurred, Nancy K. Brown, who was a 25-year-old, went missing from Cocoa Beach, Florida, and she would be found in the Canaveral Groves, which was where Teresa Ferguson, who was linked to Christopher, was found. This could just be a coincidence, or it could be a dumping ground that Christopher knew well. A month later, in the same location as where Nancy K. was abducted in Cocoa Beach, Florida, Tammy Lynn Laporte would disappear. And I've done a whole video on her very strange case, but she was also a model who would have been his perfect victim. Sherilyn Ball was a 20-year-old model who went missing from the Boca Raton, Florida area, and she was found in New York, and she was a model. She'd been abducted that October, but again, no links were found. There was another case of a 15-year-old named Colleen Osborne who disappeared from the Daytona Beach, Florida area on March 15th of 1984. Now, this would be between the murder spree. It was actually in the middle of Christopher's murder spree between the second and the third victim, which is why this one specifically is really thought to be connected to Christopher. Christopher was also found to be staying in a Daytona Beach hotel the day she went missing and checked out that day, but there's no actual connection to have said that her case was connected to Christopher's, and she was found a few weeks later partially buried. However, he didn't often bury his victims, but the methods in which he murdered and disposed of the bodies were also different, that it didn't necessarily mean that that couldn't have been Christopher. Now, Christopher's brother Stephen was interviewed after he was caught, and he said, "He must have snapped. He went crazy. He wasn't the same person I knew. It's terrible. It's a mess." He also said that Christopher was a loner who wasn't a millionaire but claimed to be one to impress women. He said he always had trouble establishing relationships, which can be a form of attachment issues, which we've talked about before, and it can be called RAD, reactive attachment disorder. But Stephen ultimately said he was happy his brother had been stopped. Christopher's therapist that he had had for a very long time before these murders began said he was a deeply disturbed walking time bomb, and investigators said in a homicide investigation you have to be methodical and discount nothing. In this business you don't deal only with the deceased but with the life of the potential suspect, because he could get the electric chair for first-degree murder. There's nothing you can do first. We had no proof that he was a maniac. But this is what frustrates me so much about this society. I mean, this therapist had seen how deeply disturbed he was, and yet nothing had happened. Now, action needs to be taken before the killing begins, not when they prove that they will kill. I hear so often that people who we know as a society, as doctors, as therapists, that they are not right in their minds. We know this, and yet I hear so often, well, nothing can be done until they get bad enough. And what does bad enough mean? That they're going to kill someone? That they're going to hurt themselves? How many innocent lives have to be taken before we realize that something needs to happen prior to them getting that far? That's all I'm going to say. This case could have been stopped if this therapist had maybe talked to more people, had maybe gotten him help, had maybe put him in an area where he was safe from himself and for others. And that's something that I would really like to see change in the way that this world works, because it could have changed everything, could have saved so many people, so many traumatic events that would happen to them, and could have saved their lives. I know this was a super long video. I hope you enjoyed it. You guys really liked the long video I did on David Michael Kruger, and I want to give you what you want, and so I really hope you enjoyed this. I loved doing a longer case, and I hope you know that doing these serial killer cases to me isn't about the serial killer. It's about the victims. I do enjoy looking into the mind of killers, so that we can potentially stop them in the future. But to me, the story is more about the victims, and I did try to add as many personal information bits that I could in here about each girl. However, there wasn't a ton, unfortunately, because a lot of people don't focus on them, which I think is heartbreaking, but I did the best that I could, and I hope that you can see that. If you're excited for Wicked Winter and want longer videos, please give this a thumbs up, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.